Thanks, Lascan. Well, Minister, given our experience of the last decade in relation to the performance in delivering social housing, would you agree with the many civil society, excellent civil society groups, such as, for example, the Mercy Law Resource Centre, that we should insert a right to housing into our constitution? A lot of colleagues around the House, of course, have tried to bring forward motions and bills on this, and my colleague Deputy Thomas Pringle, of course, introduced his 37th Amendment to the Constitution, Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So do you think it is now time, Minister, to have this in our Constitution?
Minister, 2 minutes.
As the Deputy will be aware, the 8th report of the Convention on the Constitution recommended that a range of economic and social rights, including the right to housing, should be inserted into the Constitution, subject to available resources. A motion to refer that report to the Joint Committee on Finance, Public Expenditure and Reform and Taoiseach was passed by the Dáil on the 28th of September of 2017 and by the Seanad on the 11th of October of 2017. I look forward to the Committee's deliberation on the matter in due course. I previously stated that I believe that the Convention on the Constitution proposal merits further thought and due and careful consideration, paying particular attention to the role of government, rather than the courts, in deciding on the allocation of resources. I also firmly believe that the best way of ensuring that the state fully meets its obligations to those who need a home is through continued delivery on the ambitious programme of action set out in the Government's Rebuilding Ireland Action Plan on Housing and Homelessness, and the development and implementation of further policies and measures as they are required. The significantly increased exchequer investment in housing since 2016 is resulting in a substantial ramping up in social housing delivery and a consequential reduction in the numbers on housing waiting lists. The wider programme of actions that's being implemented is also resulting in considerable increases in the supply of housing in the market more generally. This demonstrates how an unprecedented level of political and financial commitment can deliver real housing supports on the ground for those who need them most, responding effectively to the housing needs of our most vulnerable citizens, while positioning others in society to meet their housing needs themselves. I and the Government will remain firmly focused on making the further progress necessary in this regard, irrespective of what transpires in relation to the consideration of the Convention on the Constitution's report. Thank you.
It would give a basic floor of protection. I mean, something like, I think, 81 jurisdictions around the world either have a constitutional right or a legislative right, and most of our EU partners, for example, and obviously countries like, I think, Finland, Scotland, France now, which has the Dáil Act, have, legislatively or constitutionally insisted that people do have a right to shelter. We also obviously have all the international, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the European Social Charter. I mean, all of those also seem to indicate that you should move on this. You seem to be saying, like in your answer, that in some way a right to housing in the Constitution would impinge on a government's ability to actually deliver housing. But the reality is you haven't done that, and you're still only beginning to ramp up. I think we're often told, of course, Articles 40 and I think 43 lay down the right of private ownership and the general right to transfer, bequeath and inherit property. But of course there is the section which delimits that right already. But it still needs strengthening, Minister. And surely this is something that you might like to be associated with, given that it's your responsibility as Housing Minister.
Minister.
And thank you, Deputy, for the question. Deputy, very recently in Irish history we've had two very important changes to our Constitution, three. Yeah. And they followed processes that came through conventions, that came through Oireachtas committees. So I'm happy to let the committee do its work to deliberate on this matter and come back with recommendations to the Dáil and to the Government, and to then go from there. But other countries that have a constitutional right or a legal right to housing have not been able to provide the kind of floor that you're talking about. Because if you look at those that have constitutional rights, South Africa, Belgium, Finland, Spain, Sweden, they have a homeless problem. Yeah. They have a housing problem as well. Those who have a legal right, Austria, France, Germany, Luxembourg, Scotland, also have housing and homeless problems as well. So it doesn't necessarily put in the floor that you talk about. I think people have a right to security and dignity, of course they do. I think the Government has a responsibility to provide housing, and that's why we have this ambitious programme, which started in Rebuilding Ireland as 50,000 homes, but is now under the National Development Plan, 110,000 homes between this year and 2027. Social housing homes will be provided. On top of that, we'll also have subsidised homes in terms of the affordability schemes that we're rolling out as well. So the Government is working through its money and through its policy and through its resources to actually do everything it can to meet the housing needs of people. We don't need a constitutional right or a legal obligation to do that. We will do that anyway. And if the committee then comes forward with a recommendation in that regard, we will consider it in all fairness.
Yeah, but I mean, if it's there in Constitution, Minister, in legislation, you can go into court and argue. You can advocate for people who are homeless in the legal system. That in fact is precluded at the moment. And I mean, what's your own views? What do you think, though? I mean, you're the Minister for Housing. Like, is this something that you would lead? Generally speaking, we had political leadership on some of the other matters that you referred to. And can I just ask you? I mean, like, what do you think that even at least if there's not a general constitutional right to housing, that given that there's 4,000 children now in homeless accommodation and thousands, of course, of others living in overcrowded accommodation, would you at least favour, Minister, a constitutional amendment to give children a right to housing? And given the strong criticism that we've heard in the past, for example, from the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commissioner Emily Logan, where she talks about homelessness is an acute denial of children's human rights, Minister.
Thank you, Corner. Deputy, I don't need someone to go into the courts to advocate for people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. We are doing a huge amount of work, working with the local authorities and through funding our partner organisations like McVery Trust, like Focus, to put in every care and support that we can for people who are sleeping rough, for people in emergency accommodation, or for people at risk of entering emergency accommodation as well. Next year, the Government of Ireland will spend more money on housing than it has ever spent in a single year. That's the commitment, that's the dedication that we are given to solving our housing problem and our homelessness crisis. But we have to ask ourselves a question about the balance of power and the balance of responsibility between the judiciary and the Oireachtas when it comes to the allocation of resources. And that is something that the committee is looking at. But that said, we can find ways within the existing constitutional provisions to actually look at the current balance of power between the individual and the collective to see if we can rebalance it towards the collective. So, for example, we introduce the vacant site levy, where we are now taxing people based on how they are not using their land, or rent pressure zones, where we are capping the amount of money that people can earn from their own property, and we're also changing other rights around that as well. So within the existing constitutional provisions, without making a change to the Constitution, we can rebalance things in favour of the collective to meet people's demands and needs when it comes to housing, and particularly when it comes to this terrible crisis that we have in homelessness. And that's what we are doing. And we will wait for, Deputy, we'll wait for the committee to adjudicate, and then we'll consider that its adjudication on the matter.
Deputy Broughan, you finished?
I've had a couple of shots.